It's Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and BC, and all those 4 provinces are expected to have very strong economies in 2018 as well. We're not seeing that there's a negative impact on the economy from cap and trade, and really, it shouldn't be much of a surprise because $2 billion raised a year in Ontario is a lot to go towards fighting climate change. It's going to help us buy a lot of electric cars and put solar panels on our roofs, but $2 billion in the context of an $800 billion economy is not a lot, right? I mean, the last provincial budget, the government just announced they were going to go for an $8 billion deficit. Like, $2 billion in this economy is not a lot of money. And so it's not going to have a big impact on the economy, on economic growth, or on jobs, quite frankly. It's about kind of shifting things a little bit, and it enables a bunch of other policies and a bunch of other things to go into effect. And this has been modeled, Dave Sawyer out of Environmental Economics modeled the impacts of cap and trade before the province moved forward with it. And he said, basically it's going to have virtually no impact on the economy. And he's done some of that modeling at the federal level as well. And this is the same thing that we saw from the federal government just earlier about their carbon pricing backstop and the impact it would have on the economy. And their answer was basically none, because it's small in the context of the Canadian economy or the Ontario economy. So, now cap and trade is not just in theory that it's not going to kill jobs. It hasn't killed jobs. It did not kill jobs. It didn't hurt the economy. We wanted to then look to emissions. Has cap and trade and the climate plan done anything on emissions? And here on emissions, we really are just looking at carbon pricing, because the other policies, except for a couple of incentive programs that have been launched, the other policies have been committed, but they haven't yet been enacted, or they haven't had much time to take effect. But pricing took effect January 1, 2017. The price of gasoline went up by 4.3 cents as a result of cap and trade. Did it have any impact on gasoline use? It doesn't look that way based on this graph. You see a little dip in Q1 of 2017. Maybe that's because there was a big media cycle about we're bringing in carbon pricing, and maybe a couple people bought in advance, or who knows. But we ended 2017 with gasoline sales higher than they've ever have been before. Now the economy's growing, we're adding new people to Ontario, more cars on the road, so that shouldn't come as a surprise. But the point is only that the pricing from cap and trade has not led to a decrease in gasoline yet. It's early to say though, and the price is low, as we know. I mean, just like the $2 billion is low in the context of Ontario's economy, 4.3 cents is a small impact on the price of gasoline. So we shouldn't have expected to see much of an impact. We looked at natural gas sales though, and we did see something interesting there. We can't attribute this to cap and trade necessarily, but it certainly is an interesting natural gas use in the rest of Canada that grew in 2017 over 2016, but it actually dropped in Ontario, and that drop was driven by a drop in industrial natural gas use. So that's a good sign. It shows that things are tracking in the right direction in Ontario. Again, can't attribute that to cap and trade, but it's an indicator that things might be headed in the right direction. Emissions are continuing to come down in the province. And we're not going to have overall data for where emissions were in 2017 until, for about another year. And then we're going to be able to know where were emissions in 2017 relative to 2016. There's a big lag from when emissions are actually emitted and when the data is made available. So we looked at some other kind of general progress. How did things go in year one of cap and trade? In terms of the auctions, it went really well. 96% of the permits sold for the 2017 vintages, and 70% of the future vintages, 2020 vintages, sold. And this, mind you, is in the context where we have a great deal of uncertainty, right? There was uncertainty in some other jurisdictions in California, which then got settled. But I mean, we know that even Patrick Brown was promising to get rid of cap and trade. In fact, he made that commitment on the eve of one of the auctions, but businesses still showed confidence in the system. They still bought the permits. They bought almost all of the permits, in fact. So this is a good sign. I think the auctions went better than anybody expected, including the government. And this is, looking at some of the other action plan stuff. And again, carbon pricing, we totally support it. It's a necessary policy. But I don't know of, and I've asked other people, do they know of any jurisdiction in the world that's just dealing with climate change with carbon pricing? And I haven't been able to find one. And we looked at California because we're linked now with California. This is what California's policy looks like. Yes, they have cap and trade, but they also have a policy around renewable energy. They want to, move on energy efficiency. They want to support clean cars. They're building public transit. They're dealing with super pollutants, a whole bunch of other things. And so that's, again, the approach that we're seeing in Ontario and that we actually support in Ontario and support federally. We looked at the action plan. There's, some, 77 actions in the action plan. How many of them have moved forward? The answer is some have and some haven't. This is to be expected because not everything was supposed to happen in 2017, but even some of the things that were supposed to happen in 2017 didn't actually go forward. So if you want to look at the report, we kind of broke this down in more detail, but I don't have time to kind of go over it right now. But progress is being made. It hasn't all been made yet, though. But there was one area where we did see something actually different in Ontario, a real world change, and that is electric vehicle sales. So Ontario has the most generous incentives for electric vehicles of any province in Canada. You can get up to $14,000 in rebate, actually. And it looks like those rebates and some of the other things the government's doing is they're also building electric vehicle charging stations, all funded from cap and trade. Looks like that's starting to work. So Ontario, 120% increase in electric vehicle sales in 2017 over 2016. That's an enormous leap. It grew faster in Ontario than in any other province. And in fact, this was the first year that Ontario outsold Quebec in terms of the total number of electric cars sold. Quebec still wins on a per capita basis, but looks like we're making some headway on this. And transportation is the largest source of emissions in Ontario. So this move to electric cars is actually really important. And also, we have a really clean grid here in Ontario, right? We got rid of coal. We use a bit of natural gas, but it's a really clean grid. So electric cars in Ontario are really clean. They're a big leap from internal combustion engines. That's it for my slideshow. So I will stop sharing the screen here. And I know there were a couple of questions that I was sent in advance. Do you want me to answer those, or do you want to take some questions live?
I will put up the questions shortly, the 3 that were sent ahead of time, and we'll proceed from there. But I just want to say, excellent presentation. Thank you. It's early days, and I really hope that we can continue having a carbon pricing policy in Canada after this election. And that leads me into our first question from Elaine. And is it possible legally, economically, politically to dismantle cap and trade between Ontario, Quebec, and California?
Yeah, it is. And I don't know if Mark wants to weigh in on this too, because I know he's looked at this question. The answer is, yeah, you could do it, but it's not easy. You have to give the other WCI partners a full year's notice, and so you would have to change the law, right? There's the Climate Change Mitigation and Low Carbon Economy Act would need to be amended or struck down. So you would need to have a majority of votes inside the legislature to do that. So, and then you need to figure out how you're going to compensate all of the folks who have bought the permits. Now, one thing that's important is the cap and trade permits don't actually expire. They're good into another compliance period. So at the end of this compliance period at 2020, you're going to have to surrender enough permits for all the emissions that you put out, but you might have some left over. And if you go before the end of the compliance period, then you have to buy back all of those. And it's $2.4 billion have been spent into cap and trade now, and it's going to be $2 billion. And so in total, by the time this compliance period's over, we're talking about $8 billion. So it's expensive, and you're basically breaking contracts. So it can be done, but it's complex. It will be costly, and I don't know whether it's a good move. I mean, I don't know whether you win any political points on that. Actually, I don't think that the polling would suggest that you do. And in talking to industry here, a lot of the industry prefer cap and trade because they get free allowances. We think they get too many, but they get free allowances, so there's not an issue with competitiveness for them. And not only that, but they get to use the money to invest in emissions reductions that they might need to do. So they make a claim. They say, look, it's hard for us to get money from the head office here because we're just a branch plant and blah, blah, blah. Whereas if they can get money specifically earmarked for emissions reductions in Ontario, it makes them easier for those projects to go forward. So I don't know. I mean, a lot of folks, we were talking to folks in Patrick Brown's camp for the change of leadership, and they said, you know what, to be honest, we're campaigning on this, we're going to get into power, and then we'll see, right? If actually everybody likes it and it's working well, maybe we'll just keep it in place. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Okay, that's interesting to hear, and thank you for that. What Citizens Climate Lobby envisions is a global price on carbon. So one of the concerns we have is that it's going to be difficult to harmonize carbon pricing across the Canadian Federation and then across the world if we have different types of carbon pricing. And the reason why we need to harmonize this is so we can have our federal government enact border tax adjustments eventually to prevent leakage, as well as ensure industrial competitiveness. So that leads me to this question: does a cap and trade price of $10 a ton equal a cap and trade carbon tax price of $10? And how can cap and trade be harmonized with carbon taxes?
So the answer to the first question, is $10 a ton, $10 a ton, and I don't think that it is really, no. And there's been some, and again, I know Mark's done some analysis on this too, but there's been some questions about, so Ontario's carbon price is low. It's about $18, right? Which is lower than, what the price is in Alberta, and it's lower than the federal backstop's going to be when it comes in. But the cap and trade system is actually a more stringent system because it's a hard cap. Now, there's criticisms about this because some of the emissions reductions are going to be accomplished by buying permits from California, and some people, that doesn't sit well with them. We would definitely prefer to see more emissions reductions happen domestically. But the analysis that was done for the provincial government showed that in an unlinked cap and trade system, you would need to have, the price of permits would be $150 per ton. And if you wanted to go with a carbon tax, you would need it to be $70 a ton to accomplish the same outcome. And so, this is the most cost-effective way for Ontario to go at it. We're buying some permits from California, but California is a leader in the U.S. in fighting climate change. They're serious about it. They've got very comprehensive policy. They've been doing it for a long time. They've got targets out to 2030 that track with ours. They're getting to a 40% reduction or so by 2030. So the linkage, just like cap and trade allows you to trade within jurisdictions, you can trade between jurisdictions, and that brings the price down. And it means significant savings for Ontario and for Quebec. So in terms of stringency, the same price does not have the same impact because of the way the systems are set up differently. Could you harmonize them? You could. The way that you would is that in the cap and trade system, you have a price floor. So there's a minimum price for permits. And you could set that price floor at the same level you've got the minimum carbon tax set at. You could index it to, the federal carbon tax. And you could even set a price ceiling. There's a maximum price. And you could, again, make a narrow band and say, well, cap and trade permits are going to cost roughly the same as the carbon tax. Maybe that's the way it'll go. What is happening is that the federal government is going to do an assessment of the stringency of different pricing approaches, and they're going to determine whether or not, the cap and trade system is delivering equal reductions to the carbon tax. And if it's equal, then cap and trade will stay as is, and if it's not, they're going to have to figure out how to make them equal. It's our view, and I think the assessments that we've seen is that it's not only is it equal, it's actually a more stringent system. So we're probably not going to get price harmonization. But, then there's another thing that, in Europe, they have the EU ETS. So all of these countries in Europe are part of an emissions trading system. So they have a common price. China's talking about cap and trade. Mexico's talking about cap and trade. The problem, and the Paris Agreement has Article 6, which allows for this trading between jurisdictions. I think, honestly, the easiest way you get a harmonized price is that you get into a linked trading system. And I understand that there's some concerns with that. I have concerns with that too. But that's probably the easiest path to a global price on carbon, is that we get into a global market where we're trading, permits, just like we have a global price on oil, we'll have a global price on carbon.
Okay. You really gave us a lot of food for thought, and I really appreciate that. And it's early days, and just to be clear, a Citizens Climate Lobby is for a carbon fee and dividend, and we're not against anything. And we won't let perfection be the enemy of the good. And we want to at the end of the day, we want to just keep moving forward on carbon pricing. So thank you for helping us see the future a little bit better. I really appreciate that.
If I could make just one more comment to you, which is that my view is in jurisdictions where we have a policy in place, we should actually do what we can to support those policies, because like you say, it's early days. So let's see if cap and trade is working in Ontario, right? Let's see if the things in Alberta, what they promised, if they get delivered and if they work. And if we need to change approaches and we need to ratchet up and all that kind of stuff, let's do that when we get there. But right now, to be constantly doing this policy throttling and infighting about which policy is best, I think it's very counterproductive.
Yes, I agree. We agree 100%. And we should be stopping really soon, but I really wanted to ask this last question, and don't worry, Katerina, I can answer your question later as well, because I don't think we'll have time for it. So long-term planning and the fluctuating market price. So how is the price on carbon through cap and trade supposed to influence demand for long lead time projects when no one knows what the price will be in future years? So John is asking, as I understand it, it's supposed to float with the market for allowances, supported by a very weak minimum price for allowances. So if the price is fluctuating, how are people supposed, who have to make big purchases, like companies, how are they supposed to plan?
It's a good question. They forecast where prices are going. So you could go on to a couple of different organizations. I think ICF has a forecast out there, but they model it based on the emissions trends and how expensive they think it's going to be to reduce emissions, and so therefore the scarcity that they anticipate around permits, which is going to drive prices. So the best thing to do is to look at the trend and see where you think it's going. But the other thing is that for these long-term pieces and the long lead times, et cetera, is I think in jurisdictions where there's money from the carbon price that can go towards helping industries or other people make these bigger investments, that there's money that can be given to them to make those investments. So they make the case that this has a payback period of however long, and they can make a case that they should be eligible for some of that money that got raised through carbon pricing, so they can invest into it. And that's exactly what Ontario is doing.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, we said 25 minutes. This was really wonderful. Thank you, Keith, for being with us here today. This will be posted online, and I really appreciate all that you've shared with us today. It's been very helpful and very insightful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Lots of clapping out there. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video. We're going to take a 2-minute break. Oh, wait a second.